I actually saw my neighbor um, fall out of her window high on heroin when I was, I think, in eighth or ninth grade. Yeah, we're calling them Generation O, the children of the opioid epidemic.
Hello and welcome to our podcast Pager. I'm George Milner.
And I'm Stan Dale.
Tune in to hear us talk with some amazing people about the subjects changing medicine today.
From stem cells to mapping the brain and medical ethics, we hope to give you a glimpse of the bright future ahead through discussions with some of the people making it happen. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. In this episode, we're joined by Swathi Srinivasan again, who's talking to us this time about the opioid epidemic in America. We talk a lot about the role that the pharmaceutical industry played in causing the epidemic, how the country's social problems are perpetuating the issue, and how humanising drug users might be part of the solution. We hope you enjoy the episode. 3, 2, 1, and we're live. Swathi, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
How are you doing?
Doing well.
So this episode, we're going to be speaking about the opioid epidemic in America. And I was wondering if you could start the conversation by just explaining to people what we actually mean by the opioid epidemic.
Yeah, so the United States isn't a stranger to opioids. Actually, they've been around for quite a while, but the epidemic that a lot of people are talking about is this much more modern issue that has come as a result of pharmaceutical overprescription and just the addition of incredibly addictive pharmaceutical drugs on the American populace. So in 2017, the Department of Health and Human Services declared a public health emergency in the United States, which, if you were to look at the numbers, meant that about 10 million people had in some way misused opioids in the year 2018, which we saw. More than 100 people died every day from an opioid-related drug overdose. Almost 2 million people had an opioid use-related disorder within the year. So a lot of very interesting issues that popped up with many different causal factors. But what we were seeing was the number of opioid overdose deaths skyrocketed. And, there are a number of reasons for this. Obviously, we look to initial heroin use, in addition to the prescription pill epidemic, in addition to the rise of fentanyl.
So I suppose when we speak about the epidemic, what people are talking about is the fact that the use of opioids in America is suddenly leading to so many more deaths throughout the country each year. I think I read somewhere that it's up to 72,000 people died last year, which is, I think, more people than were killed in car accidents. So.
Yes. Yeah. So we're seeing the deaths attributed to synthetic opioids rise for sure. And that's one side of things. We're also seeing the number of people who are using and abusing drugs that were otherwise prescribed to be increasing as well. Now, there are a number of reasons for this. Again, looking at the opioid epidemic in the United States and talking about the history of the pharmaceutical industry and, the idea that certain drugs were marketed specifically to people who were, of at-risk populations and who were in pain, and were also marketed to be much less addictive than they turned out to be. There were a lot of perverse incentives in place. And, when you got that group of people involved in opioid use that could range from, the pastor's son, the teacher's daughter, a friend, it changed a lot of what we thought drug use looked like in this country.
But I guess the thing I'm trying to understand fully is the scale of this problem right now. So this really is one of the biggest public health issues in the country at the moment. Would that be fair to say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for certain. It's probably the biggest public health epidemic faced in this generation. It's comparable in some ways to the HIV/AIDS epidemic and, prior drug epidemics, but the scale of this is nothing like we've ever seen before.
Okay, wow. So why don't we talk a bit about how this epidemic actually came into being? We've spoken a bit about the role that maybe prescription opioids have played, as well as the fact that there are now very lethal, to be honest, synthetic opioids such as fentanyl, which are being used illegally. Sort of what is the narrative story as we go from, okay, people have heroin addiction in maybe the inner cities in the, correct me if I'm wrong, like the 80s and the 90s, to this being something which affects pretty much every facet of the society now?
It's interesting because the opioid epidemic in the United States is seen in stages. So the earliest stage that people really discuss is an epidemic from like the 1950s, 60s that was, white individuals. The 1960s and 70s where the heroin epidemic hit non-white people in inner cities. And then it the people that survived that epidemic we're seeing to die now with the rise of fentanyl. So it's fascinating as that's one side of things. The other side of things is, this slightly less racial, racial dynamic, but much more of like the suburban and rural dynamic where we're seeing, even though there was a decline in heroin use among Americans around the late 1990s, when we started prescribing OxyContin around 1996, this trend reversed. And this overprescription and prescription drug abuse that ended up occurring would ultimately produce a generation of white working class drug users. We saw that once the problem started to hit, moderately wealthy and suburban and rural white families, that attention started to turn. But with the eyesight and the focus and attention on white families, some people believe there's a trickle down in the services that are provided to people of color. Some people believe that there's an imbalance in the way that treatment is occurring and that it's racially charged. Some people see it as a unanimous epidemic. It's affecting everyone, which leans close to the truth. And what we're seeing is, regardless of what your race is, your gender, your age, that fentanyl is responsible for more deaths among any of these users than anything we've ever seen before. So people who had survived the 1960s and 70s epidemic, who continue to use for the last 40, 50 years, are dying now.
And also, one thing I took out of what you said is that really, if we're thinking about this, the emergence of this public health crisis as a narrative, it almost comes from what I could tell. There's really two narratives running parallel to one another. So perhaps it was the use of illegal heroin in the inner cities, which led to sort of Black and Latin communities being affected. Whereas it was perhaps the use of prescription opioids, which led to white people in sort of more suburban areas of the country being affected. Would that be fair to say?
There's definitely crossover between those two groups, but we've seen those as general trends. So it really depends on where you are and what the socioeconomic status of the region is, what sort of resources are available. If you think about how Boston is approaching the opioid epidemic, we have something like the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless Clinic, which is a homeless shelter that has a health clinic embedded within it, where 70% of the homeless individuals are opioid users. But the people that are working at this clinic are all multilingual, that are all trained on cultural diversity and working with people from different backgrounds. And that sort of method for addressing the epidemic is unlike what we see anywhere else in the country. There are some places that obviously try to mimic this, but this is a very special example. And that's more of the response that we're trying to look for.
Okay, that's interesting, because it strikes me as something, it was very much a product of the way that healthcare is structured in America that this was able to happen.
Yeah.
And maybe we should have a think about what is to stop another Purdue Pharma from coming along and doing something similar.
Yeah, of course. So that's obviously, one of the big targets for people who are looking to pinpoint where this epidemic started. For those who, I guess, don't have a background in kind of Purdue Pharma's work, in 1996, OxyContin was marketed by Purdue Pharma, which was a pharmaceutical company that was owned by the Sackler family. And at this point, there's obviously a narrative. There were these three brothers, and one of them had left the company by this point, Arthur Sackler, whose name is all over Harvard's campus. But the other two brothers were much more concerned with profit making. And here was something that at the end of a very long period where, the United States was constantly entrenched in war, we had a bunch of people coming back from various different combats and battles. We found a way finally to address pain in a pretty successful way that made people feel good. And they marketed it in this way that was like, it's not a bad thing to feel pain. Like, we have this solution to it, like all this stuff that you bottled up, like, it's okay. And so with those marketing tactics, OxyContin reached the shelves and just sort of flew off of it. Doctors started prescribing it as sort of an end-all be-all for pain medication. And we started to see that even though, it was something that was incredibly addictive, it was not marketed as such. And those disclaimers were not part of FDA regulation until a little bit later. But yeah, we created, this group of people who, after the advertisement over prescription of painkillers, made the opioid epidemic what it was. It was the catalyst, right? And so to obviously, we see the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma as, big instigators of this epidemic in a lot of ways. But, over time, we've seen this change a little bit that, now the doctors are learning better and doing more. Why is it that we still have an epidemic, and what's this issue all about now? And that's kind of the questions we're tackling now.
So essentially, what we're saying is that opioids can be used to relieve pain. They have an analgesic effect.
Mm-hmm.
And this company, Purdue Pharma, developed a drug called Oxycontin, which prior to this drug, people had mostly thought of using opioids for relieving sort of acute pain, so sort of post-operatively or in other sort of situations where somebody was expected to recover quite quickly. But this drug was marketed, perhaps incorrectly, as being an effective sort of long-term chronic pain medication. And I suppose the other really interesting factor we had to consider is, from my understanding, this pharmaceutical company pressured doctors quite aggressively, or advertised to doctors quite aggressively to prescribe their medication. It really speaks to the trust that people have in doctors, that you're prescribed painkillers by your doctor and you take them sort of without
No, but
questioning.
what's super fascinating about this is, what you just mentioned, right? That, it speaks to the trust that people have. If you look on the flip side of that, the people that don't trust the health systems, like, we actually found something really interesting wherein doctors are prescribing less or overprescribing less to people of color. So in some ways, and I hate to call it a protective effect because it's definitely not intentional. It's not out of any well regard, for these individuals. Like, some people are saying, it's because of this implicit bias wherein doctors see people of color as experiencing less pain, despite them coming in with the same issues as their white counterparts. And because of this, they're prescribing less to those individuals who have come in with pain. And somehow, because of this opioid epidemic wherein, prescribing certain medications has led to addiction, we're not seeing that as strongly for the origins of the opioid epidemic among people of color.
Wow. But inadvertently, that was almost benefiting them because it made them less
It
likely to
was,
be
certainly,
victims of
yes.
this opioid epidemic.
Exactly.
Wow.
And that's one of the most interesting things that I've read about and I've learned about is that, as much as we're talking about the effects on people of color, which is still incredibly large, it's a different epidemic in terms of its causes than this opioid epidemic that we're seeing among white suburban, white rural families that is the result of this prescription epidemic. So over time, we've seen multiple different iterations of this. The quantity and the sheer number of overdose deaths we're seeing now is unlike any other time, partially because of fentanyl. And that's changed the game regardless of racial background because, if you're using heroin, no matter how you started and that heroin has fentanyl, you die. Not always, obviously. We have,
when we speak about fentanyl, we're speaking about an opioid which is synthetic in nature.
Yeah,
so
fentanyl,
it's a chemically related molecule, but it's made in a lab, whereas heroin is sort of extracted from poppies.
Yes. So if we're thinking about fentanyl I think is expected to be 100 times as strong as heroin. I'm not 100% sure.
Incredibly powerful,
potent. Exactly.
Opioid.
Exactly. It's nothing like we've ever seen before, and it was created again with not the intent of being abused, as none of these I don't think were, but rather as an extreme form of treatment, or rather not treatment, but pain management. And now we've seen that be cut into.
So when I suppose, sorry, I should just clarify. When we say fentanyl is incredibly potent, not only does it have an incredibly powerful analgesic, so painkilling relieving effect, but also we're saying that because it's so potent, it can cause an overdose in much lower concentrations than something like heroin. So it can actually shut down the breathing centers in your brain. Is that right?
So the idea is, like, when it's cut into certain existing drug samples, for example, like if someone is selling heroin and they want it to be strong but they don't want it to cost as much, you take a tiny amount of fentanyl, right? Because if it's 50 to 100 times more potent than something like morphine or something like heroin, then it takes that much less to get the same effect in terms of pain relief, but also in terms of the euphoria. So that is starting to be influx. That influx is starting to influence samples of drugs around the country. And we're seeing that come in across the world, I think primarily from China, if I'm correct. And that rise in those synthetic opioids that, you can even purchase online is getting people the high that they want. But, the risk is unlike anything we've seen before, and is the reason why when people don't know how much they can use and they're not used to, like, working with anything other than heroin or other drugs they've seen before, the concentrations are much harder to evaluate. You don't know what you're getting. And that makes it incredibly difficult to know how your body's going to react to it once you use.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. I think that brings us on really well. So we've discussed sort of what the epidemic is and how it happened. And now I want to talk about something which you and I, last time we spoke about this, I think there was maybe a slight misunderstanding between us. So I'd like to talk about how this crisis could be resolved. So I was essentially asking you, is there a quick fix? And you were like, no, there isn't. You need to address the underlying socioeconomic, like all the serious problems which cause people to use drugs in the first place.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I'm wondering, like, aside from like revamping the whole, way that America treats people who, aren't wealthy, right?
Mhm.
What can the government do? What can people in healthcare do? Basically, what can be done sort of for more short-term fixes? I think you mentioned earlier the use of Narcan, which can be used to essentially revive people who have overdosed. You know,
Yeah. It
what are
depends
other
on
short-term fixes?
whatever stage you want to talk about. You could talk about someone who is just overdosed. You can talk about someone who is, at high risk. You can talk about someone who has like used once or twice, someone who hasn't even used yet. Like the points of intervention are numerous, because how do you take a person? This is just one potential case study where this person was born, homeless to a family that, maybe was a single parent, went to not a great school, didn't finish school, was in this community where, they were brought up around drug use, started using drugs because mom was using drugs, and then, continued to use. And, overdose is not something that's uncommon for them. So how do you first bring that person to the health system, right? All these different questions, or how is it that this person doesn't die from this new batch of heroin that is now laced with fentanyl? Or what do they do when they see their parent, maybe pass away from an overdose, and now, they have severe PTSD and trauma, and that, in addition to their opioid use disorder, worsens their opioid use disorder. Like, these are all they seem very niche, but very common cases where people face co-occurring disorders, mental health issues, all sorts of things like that. So when we talk about intervention points and things that we can do for quick fixes, we have to think, who are we helping here? And at what stage are we helping them? And in a lot of ways, I think you need to answer that in pieces. One is availability, again, of Narcan, because that's, the final goalie. If we talk about, this being a soccer game, a person who makes it all the way to the goalie, that means it got through everyone else, all the defense, all the offense, right? Every single person on the field, and that's the stopgate before, what would end up being death, right? And so that's not a solution. It is a solution for overdose, but overdose can only happen because of XYZ steps before. So that's one thing that I think is helpful. I think, if we're talking about other public health epidemics like HIV/AIDS, Hep B, Hep C, those can be minimized by clean needles. So if people are going to use, being perceptive to the idea of needle syringe programs and needle exchange programs wherein people can use safely, getting rid of the idea that there's some sort of moral failing that occurs along with when people use. I had the privilege to go to Portugal and see a community that does not see the epidemic the same way the United States does. It does not see it as something moral. It sees it as a health hazard, and it is treated as such, wherein people, can use materials that they can use safely, and they can use in a way that doesn't put other people at hazard either. And so they choose to seek care. That care is readily available, that care is free, and the United States doesn't do that either. So one quote unquote quick fix, it's not really a quick fix at all, is a universal healthcare system in which people can seek this care without feeling any sort of repercussion for what is not a moral failing, what is not a choice, but rather what is the cause of so many other things.
Wow. Okay. So to be honest with you, I was really hoping for some actual quick fixes, but this is all sounding like it's actually quite complicated.
Yeah, I really couldn't come up with any. I don't think there are any.
I wonder if journalists and reporters, uh, I wonder if they can also play a role in humanizing this epidemic and showing people that it's other people who are being affected. Can you speak to any articles you've
Oh,
read?
for
Or you
sure.
were actually telling me the last time we spoke about
Yeah, I mean,
an entire community in northern Philadelphia where it's essentially a community of addicts, and they have somebody called the doctor who, well, he's not a doctor, but he's somebody who administers the Narcan when people overdose. Could you talk a bit about that?
I mean, I've written on that topic, and while writing on that, I talked to a lot of reporters, and one in particular was a photographer who has worked for The Atlantic, and that was where I had read his initial pieces on this area. And I asked him, what was it like to just be there? And he goes, they thought that I was a policeman. They all were initially hostile to him, and then they realized he was just there, and then he realized everyone was just there minding their own business. They all, had themselves to worry about. And I think that brought a lot to my eyes. It was my first, article that I had read on this. And I had known about the epidemic because I had lived within it, in a lot of ways. But it was the first time that I'd seen it in the national news in such a vivid way. And I think that was incredibly jarring. And that elicited something in me that was entirely like I started to get it. point, like what the immediacy and urgency of this was when I saw it in that like a woman's eyes, and I saw it in these individuals who just looked as though like everything was lost, right? And I think that's when you say journalists can have an incredibly humanizing role. I think that was it, right? That was I think his name is Dominic Reuter, and he just did phenomenal work. And so I think photojournalism had that effect. I was also able to speak to someone at the New York Times who wrote an amazing article a few months ago. I think in June, I want to say on June 6th, maybe, um, on this girl from Portsmouth, Ohio, Layla, who, her mom was an opioid user, is an opioid user who overdosed, this past fall. And, Layla was a person who found needles in her laundry and, who had a 3.7 grade point average out of 4 and was like, does a lot of sports, wants to be a nurse, with this mom that doesn't go to her sports games, who, ditches her to go use heroin with her friends. And this article was incredibly jarring to read, but, in the New York Times on the front page. And, that was something that I had never seen before in such a vivid way where, they made it personal again. And I actually...
Wow, it also shows that somebody can be born in an entire
Oh,
environment
yeah,
which
fully.
is really geared towards not working against them
And
entirely.
exactly. And,
And obviously young people as well being
oh,
affected as well.
exactly.
Because I suppose when I think of chronic pain, I think of adults who maybe got hurt at work or what have you. But I suppose this affects
Yeah,
young
we're
people as
calling
well.
them Generation O, the children of the opioid epidemic. And in a lot of ways, what we're leaving behind with all these people that are overdosing and using our families, our friends, our people who, suffer the trauma of that. Because, I don't think humans really deal with loss at such a young age very well. And so this girl, I read her story and I was immediately like, this is someone that had everything went wrong, right? No child should have to grow up in an environment like that where success, just like making it through school, involved so much labor. I think kids should be entitled to, an education, and that education being a focus. Whereas, for her, her focus was making sure that there was food on the table for her sister, making sure there was a house above their head, they can get from point A to point B, all while juggling a full course load. And so I emailed the author of this article and he said, does this girl need any help with college applications? And, as of yesterday, she just applied to Duke. And like, we're seeing this huge shift that, it takes this much. And she just applied to Duke yesterday. Like, we've worked together to make sure that, that this camp won't be something that, ends her life. Because it shouldn't, right? She's born into this circumstance. And we're seeing that so greatly, that the number of orphans in Ohio are dramatically increasing, that there isn't enough capacity for them because of the number of opioid babies, that people who are opioid users, that the Human Services takes the kid away and now they're put into the system. And like, that's something, that's heartbreaking and that we're seeing more.
Being someone, you mentioned earlier, being someone from Ohio, you said that you had in some sort of, I assume indirect way, been affected by. So how did this issue become something which was so much in your consciousness?
I actually saw my neighbor fall out of her window high on heroin when I was, I think, in 8th or 9th grade. And you don't really forget something like that. And as someone who grew up with a very similar background that I did, we all went to the same school. She used to sleep over my house. We loved singing. I helped her study for the spelling bee. And like, here was this girl, who just had a completely different outcome than I did. And I couldn't for the life of me figure out why. And that bothered me. And then I realized that she was just one out of thousands of people in our state and in our country who would be affected by this. And that, I was like, I couldn't imagine her ever saying one day, this is something I want to do. Like, there has to be something, some underlying reason. And that's kind of when I got involved in public health, when I got involved in the opioid epidemic.
Okay, well, keep up the good work. I think that's about everything I wanted to talk about. But I want to say thank you for, speaking about what is both an incredibly human and an incredibly tragic story playing out on an enormous scale. Well, thank you so much.
Of course, anytime.
Thank you for listening to the Pager podcast. If you've enjoyed it, then head to Spotify or iTunes to hear more.
As ever, we'd love to hear what you think, and you can reach us via our Facebook page or by email. See you next time.